Conference will now be recorded.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting session of Brothers in Arms. My brother in the flesh and brother in the spirit, Steve, and we are uh, trying to go a little bit deeper into the daily, weekly Bible readings that Liberty is going through. As I've said in previous sessions, the downside of that is we have to cover so many chapters in one session that we can't go into detail on everything. So we just kind of hit some high spots, maybe go into detail on a few things, try to give some good devotional thoughts, and then move on because this is session number 6 of Brothers in Arms, and our text verse is Proverbs 17:17. A brother loves at all times, and I keep getting that backwards. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. And the readings for this past week, which would include tomorrow to get through the end of Exodus, is Exodus 16 through 20, or through 40, excuse me. So it's about 25 chapters. So it's even more than last week. And so I went back and looked at um, Truth Be Told that Mike Maney and I did a few years ago. And those 25 chapters, we took about 18 sessions. I think we did 3 or 4 sessions just in Exodus 19 because there's so much in there. So we won't do that chapter justice today, but we'll bring out some things. So we're going to compress what took in Truth Be Told, took about 18 or so sessions into one session. So hang on. We're going to have to race through it as best we can. Before we jump into it, though, Steve has something he'd like to say overall about Moses and his contribution to these writings.
I had meant to mention last week, and with an oversight, that finally, when we get to Exodus, the second chapter, between verse 10 and verse 11, now Moses is able to write with firsthand knowledge. So all the information prior to that was either given to him by God, led to him by the Holy Spirit, or had been handed down information. May have even been things that he had learned while he was getting his education in Egypt. But nevertheless, now at this point in chapter 2, between verse 10 and 11, or about that time, he's now able to capture the information he's going to share firsthand. And so we'll see that Moses, as he captures this information and as he writes it down, and we'll see today in today's session that very often he is expected by God to write all of these things down. So now he's starting to assemble firsthand information that he would probably edit over the next 39 years or so, and add to or take away. And then we can see very clear evidence of that when he starts mostly speaking in the third person, not saying I a whole lot, but saying Moses, using his name a lot, us and they a lot. So speaking or writing mostly in the third person. So that's what we're going to see moving forward. But again, I kind of wanted to note that because prior to this, it was all the leadership of God and the Holy Spirit. It is in his writing moving forward too. But now he has firsthand knowledge by observation and by experience. He would write the rest moving forward.
Yeah, it becomes more of a diary from that point
Right.
on, rather than recollecting the past with the help of the Spirit and through lots of oral tradition, passing down information from one generation to the other. Didn't take as many as most people think, and Joseph would have preserved a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses then had access to Joseph's records. So he had a lot of help. Of course, the Spirit putting it all together in an inspired fashion. And just to build on that, because I had overlooked this verse when we were reading in our daily Bible readings, and I just noticed it earlier today in 34 27 of Exodus, because so many, regarding the Ten Commandments, it clearly says it's the finger of God and that God wrote them and Moses received the 2 tablets. But there's many others, over 600 other laws that God was giving. He says in 34:27, then the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for according to the tenor of these words, I've made a covenant with you and with Israel. And so part of what Moses was doing those 40 days, 40 nights up on Mount Sinai, we think it shouldn't have taken that long for God to just give him the tablets with the finger of God. Why was it 40? But God told Moses up there, I want you to write down the rest. And so that would take time, and no doubt Moses was maybe discussing some of those laws with God for further clarification because he knew he'd be getting questions. So it's interesting how all this comes about in these first 5 books of Moses. So today we're kind of covering 16 to 40, and it opens up after the Song of Moses in 15 with those 2 great chapters. 16 is about the manna, and 17 is about the water from the rock. And they do each deserve, especially the manna did, the rock just part of a chapter, but they do deserve quite a bit of detail in Moses' writings. And one thing I thought might be good to describe these 2 daily provisions is that they were daily miracles. It took a miracle every single day to provide the manna, and it took a miracle every single day to provide the water. So they saw God's hand on a daily basis. Every morning when they woke up, there was manna. Where did it come from? How did it get there? What is it? Which is what manna means. But it provided them their daily nourishment. And the psalmist in Psalm 78:24 and 25 calls it bread from heaven, and he also calls it angels' food.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not quite sure what all that means. I didn't know angels really ate food. So we'll have to ask the Lord about that when we see him. Maybe some of you have an idea of why is it called angels' food, other than it comes from where angels dwell from heaven. But Paul, being the perfect, having perfect knowledge in his mind before his conversion, certainly after his conversion, when he was in Arabia for 3 years being taught directly by Christ, ended up with a better understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, than anyone before him or since other than Christ. I would say that Paul, by revelation, special inspiration directly from God, and he brings that up quite a bit, that I have information that really hasn't been given to anyone else. And I think part of that is a much clearer understanding of the Old Testament scriptures. So when he's recounting this whole scene in 1 Corinthians 10, he's talking about them passing, through the Red Sea, water on both sides, a cloud above. So we get the idea of total immersion language from that, which is true, it's clear. But then he also talks about the manna and the water, and he calls them spiritual. He said they ate spiritual food and they drank spiritual drink. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means. It means partly it just means it came directly from God, so it's spiritual, daily miracles. But there's something about the quality of that bread and water that fed them, nourished them in deeper ways than we probably realize. I've often said that the manna probably provided every single nourishment, nutrition. It was complete nutrition, probably provided every vitamin, mineral, trace minerals, whatever your body needs for operation, for digestion, for energy, for traveling all through the wilderness. There was something about that manna that was total nutrition. There's not a nutrition bar or a protein bar or energy bar, whatever you want to call it today, that people eat. That manna was better than all of them combined. And it seemed to provide them other benefits too. I would say it provided them weight control, probably provided all the perfect mixture of protein and carbohydrates, amino acids, whatever else you want to include, fats, that they needed. And the fact that they all were told to get the same amount does not mean they all ate the same amount. Certainly, fathers with young children would be able to eat part of their portion if the child did not eat the full portion, so that a grown man would be able to get what he needed for his size, and the young child would get what they needed for their size. And this idea of daily miracle is so important because, you know, it says that some people went out on the seventh day, as they were told not to. They're supposed to collect twice as much on the sixth day. And there were worms in it, and some tried to keep it overnight for the next day, and there were worms in it, and it became moldy and stank. So something about it is, as healthful as it was, as nourishing as it was, it quickly decayed. And there's something in there for us devotionally about looking to the Lord every day for our needs, his daily blessings. Sufficient to the day is the evil thereof. So don't always be talking about the future unless you say the Lord wills. And so each day his grace is provided, the supply is provided. And then that water also being called a spiritual drink. And we know different waters from different locations, whether it be in our day processed water through municipal water facilities, or well water, or fresh streams before too many campers ruin the streams with bacteria and so forth. It was the perfect water. It probably tasted really good, and it probably had, like the manna, probably had all of the nutrients that water is supposed to supply, besides quenching thirst. Probably had the right mixture of minerals and so forth in it, so that between the water and the manna, it supplied every single thing that their bodies needed, not just for survival, but for complete operation of what their body needed to do. So it's just there's a lot in the manna and water, but we can't really just park here too long. Is there anything you wanted to say about that, Steve?
I was just thinking as you were speaking that it was the same amount of manna that they would consume, whether they were just staying put and waiting on the Lord to give them the next marching orders, or whether they were to work very, very hard, which we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes, about the work that had to be done to build the tabernacle. Because I know myself, it requires a different amount of intake calories when I'm going to put in a hard 12 days hours worth of work versus if I'm just sitting around reading a book. But in their case, it was enough for both. So again, back to your point, more than just survival, but exactly what they needed, and exactly what they needed for that particular day.
And since God provided it every day, he could have changed the makeup according to their need. Maybe in the heat of summer, the nutritional makeup in manna was different than in the cold of winter. Or as you said, when they had to exert a lot more energy for different projects, maybe God put a boost of nutrients in the manna for those days. I mean, if it was a daily miracle, it was flexible. God could do with it on a daily basis whatever he wanted. And then chapter 18 is when he meets up with Jethro, his father-in-law. There is a mystery in that chapter. We're not really told. It says that Jethro brought out Moses' wife, Zipporah, and his 2 sons, but it doesn't say whether Moses ever addressed them directly, whether he had interactions with them directly. I'd like to think he did. It doesn't even tell us for sure if they, from that point on, went with Moses. It almost seems like they went back with her father, and Moses was just kind of on his own as far as marriage and children is concerned. And there may be some information, in Chronicles or something that adds to that idea, but it's just interesting to me that he has all this interaction with Jethro in this chapter, Jethro's advice to him, and yet it doesn't speak of any interaction between him and his wife and sons. You have any thoughts on that, Steve? I don't know what all to make of that.
Don't hear a lot of interaction between Aaron's wife either, or Miriam's husband, as far as that goes. So again, Moses being instructed by God and the Holy Spirit exactly what to write. What I'd have to lean towards on why we don't read everything that was said or done.
Yeah, that's a good point. Their mates aren't involved very much at all, are they? So then we come to chapter 19, and I look back on Truth Be Told with Mike and myself. I think we spent 3 or 4 sessions just on this one chapter. I have long been fascinated with this chapter. It is what I would call one of the pivotal chapters of the Old Testament. There is so much more in here than you first realize if you just read it slowly and think about its connection to other parts of the Bible. Not only is it dramatic in its description of the moment, of what they're going through in that story, pretty exciting, lots of noise, lots of sights, lots of fear, lots of promises, lots of everything. Very dramatic chapter. But then if you extend a lot of the language in this chapter to prophecy, to prophetic language, there's a lot in here that can be symbolic or even directly tied to language in the New Testament of the return of Christ. There's trumpets, there's the voice of God, smoke and fire and earthquakes, all kinds of things that, like Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, there's going to be the sound of a great trumpet. There's going to be the voice of the archangel, the shout of Christ, lots of noise, lots of activity, lots of things to see and hear. And chapter 19 is going into a lot of that. I know Steve has some things to share, but I would say at the beginning of chapter 19, it is Jewish tradition that Moses went up on Mount Sinai to receive the law on Pentecost. And I tend to think that is true. It's kind of easy to figure out here that in 19:1, in the 3rd month, actually, it literally says at the new moon, which would be the first day of the month, or the first day of the 3rd month. They left Egypt on the 15th, Passover the 14th and 15th. So they arrive here 45 days out of Egypt. And then by the language of the first several verses, it took a few days to settle in. And then Moses declares clearly to everyone, be ready for the 3rd day from that point. So that could easily bring us right up to the 50th day out of Egypt, which would be Pentecost. And so I think that tradition is good. I think it's accurate. And they're getting ready to receive the law, which we'll find out soon is the same law they broke right away. But what kind of things do you have in chapter 19, Steve? It's a really important chapter.
So the only thing I have is noted, at least at this point, is, this is the first time Moses went up to the top of the mountain to see God. At least that's what I have written in my notes. And then I really like verse 4. One of the first things that the Lord tells Moses, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you out, not just brought you out, but brought you out to myself. So that's kind of an important point to note. There's the reason. It's kind of similar to the reason we're going to see why he had them build a tabernacle, or he called it a sanctuary, a place for me to meet with the people. And so, if we look and read very carefully, we can see the whys. It's just not a bunch of information. It's the why, and the why is always a benefit for us. And so that'd be important to note if we were doing a devotional type thought.
Yeah, you introduced something really important in this chapter. Most Bible teachers who specialize in the Old Testament, especially in the Hebrew language and Jewish customs and all of that, are agreed that verses 4 through 6 is a marriage language, that he's entering into a marriage contract with them. And then they agree to it by saying, whatever the Lord has said, in verse 8, we will do, which is kind of a group version of I do. They're agreeing to the terms of the contract. And those verses 4 through 6, as you introduced, very romantic language, very language of a husband toward his engaged wife, speaks very tenderly of her. He wants them to keep his covenant. He wants them to keep the marriage vows, which is really what these are, God's marriage vows and their marriage vows. And he says in verse 5, if you do this, you'll be a special treasure to me above all people. Now, that's a loaded statement right there. The Hebrew word special treasure is segula. It's a really important word in Hebrew. And it carries the idea of a king's prized possession. So a king would have many valuable things. He'd be very wealthy, powerful. He'd have a treasure chest, or whatever, crown jewels. He'd have all kinds of expensive possessions. But he would have something that he would consider more prized than anything else, as very special to him. That's the word segula. And so God is telling the nation of Israel, this is what you will be to me. He says at the end of verse 5, all the earth is mine. I own everything. It's the work of my hands. It was very good when I created it. So I own everything, but I want you to be that special treasure among my treasures. It's really a high calling that God was calling the nation of Israel to. Even when they said, all that you have said we will do, in other words, agreeing to the marriage vows, they really didn't understand what a privilege, what a blessing, what an honor, but also what a responsibility. And this verse really ties in with when he said, above all people. It ties in with what happened to them that brought their downfall. It's because they grabbed hold of that idea and combined it with their pride, with arrogance, with feeling like they were special. And they elevated themselves rather than seeing themselves as a servant nation, a light to the other nations, a vessel in God's hands to be a blessing to the other nations. They saw themselves as above all nations in ways that God did not intend. They felt like they were better, smarter in every way. And God did not want pride to mix in with that calling, and it did. And that was their downfall. And so they saw their calling strictly as privilege instead of responsibility mixed in. And so this starts out on such a high level. And it was intended to humble them. You know, they're just a bunch of slaves. They were being killed. They were in danger. They were on the run from Pharaoh in Egypt. And now all of a sudden God is elevating this position to them. So it should have caused them to be grateful, to be humble, to try to live up to that by God's grace. Instead, it caused them to see themselves as head of the nations, which is the prophecy about them. If they would obey him, he would elevate them to be the head of the nations, but not apart from their humility and his grace and their obedience. And they just felt like it was, they just felt privileged. And anyway, that's what led to their downfall. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this is language, segula, that special treasure. It's used throughout the Old Testament, Deuteronomy several times. And then I like how it's used in Malachi 3:17, I believe it is, where you will make up, you will be my jewels. That idea of you're a special jewel in my crown. And it's the same word, but the translators translated it as jewels. And then that whole language of 5 and 6 is brought over into the New Testament to the church of the kingdom of priests. 1 Peter 2:5 and 9, Titus 2:14, first other places of Paul and Peter of the church's role as a kingdom of priests, or kings and priests. A royal priesthood is language used, and a holy nation. And so because the church is the method that God used to include Gentiles into that olive tree of root and fatness of the blessings and promises, we can share that same language that God is using toward Israel. But Paul warns the church, the Gentile church part especially, Romans 11, don't make the same mistake they did and get high-minded, proud, lifted up, thinking that you're better than them, which I kind of hear that language sometimes by Bible teachers and preachers, or else you could be cut off too. So we have a test of our calling, what we're going to do with it, whether in humility and love and by God's grace, or being lifted up in pride. And so this chapter 19 actually should serve as a warning to us not to follow the same path they did and elevate themselves in their own mind rather than letting God lift them up because of humility. So there's a lot in there about that. I don't know what else I want to say about chapter 19. We could spend the whole session in chapter 19, but they're just, as I said, there's just a lot about, he went up and down the mountain 3 times in this one chapter. So I think a lot of people miss that. I don't know if you tried to count up all the times Exodus talks about him going up and down. Do you have a total?
I've written in my Bible in pencil and erased it a few times. I had it when we spoke a few weeks ago. I said he went up and down the mountain at least 8 times. I've had to erase some of that because sometimes it's very unclear. If he speaks to the people and he says, "I'm going to go inquire from the Lord," and a few verses later he's back speaking to the people again.
Yeah.
So that being said, it's hard to count, but at least 8 or 9 times.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's what I think. It seems to be what it is. Some of the language is a little vague, and a lot of it is because, as you've said in the past and even today, Moses is looking back, writing this later. And so his job is not to give a minute by minute account of when he does what, but he's looking back, stating what happened, not necessarily worrying about, okay, I need to let them know I've come back down the mountain. Now I'm going back up the mountain. That's not his concern so much, but it does seem to be maybe 8 times or so. Chapter 20, of course, is the Ten Commandments. And it's repeated in Deuteronomy, of course. There's 10 commandments, we say. Of course, in the New Testament, Jesus was asked, what's the greatest? And he names two, number 1 and 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and your neighbor as yourself. And so, in a sense, all 613 so-called laws in the law of Moses can be summed up in the two. And then these 10, the two are described in more detail by the 10. So these 10 can fit in either one of the first and second great commandments. And usually it said, the first of them are regarding the first great commandment, and then the last 5 or 6 are regarding the second great commandment. And then all of the other 600 plus laws can then fit into each of these 10 in some way. It's kind of interesting how it just expands, how that God wants to keep things simple in the 2 great commandments. He said, if you fulfill these 2, you have fulfilled all the law. So those 2 are easy to understand. If you live your life trying to follow those 2, you'll be keeping the entirety of the law in some way. But then he does break it down into 10 so that we can understand the 2 better. And then he breaks it down because they were going into the land as a nation, and they needed the details of how these laws were to work out in their daily life once they conquered and settled the land. So they needed much more detail of the various laws, how the 10 were to be worked out as a nation. It's just interesting how God is able to simplify such a vast number of laws down into 10 and then down into 2. Help us understand. What would you say about all this?
Well, then he goes on to, expand those 10 and talk about a lot of laws concerning, for instance, servants. And as you mentioned the other day in a conversation, the law of a servant was to be meant to be temporary. How they would spend 6 years with them, but on the 7th year they would go free and pay nothing unless they wanted to stay. And you had mentioned that in many cases maybe they were paying off a debt. In some cases maybe they wanted to stay, they were just an employee, but nevertheless they were offered to be released after 7 years. So again, it was supposed to be temporary, not like they had experienced in Egypt, where 400 years or maybe less than that, they didn't have that kind of freedom to come and go. There wasn't a law in Egypt about every 7 years we're going to offer you guys the choice to move home or to go away. There was none of that. So again, God wanting them to practice something different than they had saw in their life when he expanded that to the law concerning servants, concerning personal injuries to one another or to another one's servant, personal responsibility when it came to animals, how to treat them, how to work them, how to feed them, proper rights among each other, moral and ceremonial principles God lays out, laws of justice, laws of Sabbath, which also included the land, the laws of expectation of the 3 annual feast a year that they were responsible for being part of. So a lot of information was expanded here in the next few chapters that, I said when I was speaking to you a few days ago that the need of that may have been because they did not experience that in Egypt. When an Egyptian knocked out the eye of a servant or beat him to death, there was probably no ramifications for that. There was no penalties for that. It was important for God to let them know, no, what you saw, what you experienced in Egypt is not how you're going to conduct yourself moving forward. So the past experiences they had, the current experiences they were going to have for the next 40 years as they walked and winded through various nations and regions, they're going to see some crazy stuff. And they needed to know that God made a difference between not only them and the other nations from a relationship standpoint, but you're going to conduct yourself very differently too, so the other nations will see there's a difference. And for sure, these would be expectations from God when they came into the land of Canaan and started occupying that land, because of all the ites and those folks that they would have to displace that were conducting themselves very evilly in their daily contact. So, the next few chapters that expands on the Ten Commandments really kind of lays out that you're going to conduct yourself differently than any other nation that is known on the earth at that time. So that's some of the thoughts that I received when I read the expansion of the laws.
Yeah, given those kind of laws, especially as you said regarding animals and dealing with others, crimes and slavery of some type, was such a drastic change. At least we would probably say a couple of generations had been slaves in Egypt. So that's all they knew, was how a slave was to be treated. And now God is wanting them to be a holy nation. Well, a holy nation isn't going to operate like they were dealt with in Egypt. A holy nation is going to live a much higher level of life, family life, national life, religious life. And so they needed to know right away what God was going to give them as a blessing, because the law really, compared to what they faced in Egypt, the law was a blessing. It provided them a lot of good things, but also provided structure. And they didn't have much structure in Egypt other than their taskmasters, beating on them all day, telling them to work harder. They need a structure on how to operate as families, as a nation, as tribes toward each other, toward the other nations around them. And the law provided that structure, which is really important in life. Everyone needs some amount of structure in their life. Families certainly do, churches do, nations do. And so the law provided that. So we need to see what God was giving them as a blessing. And then, as you said, they were what we would call outright slaves in Egypt. Their owners could do with them whatever they wanted, pretty much. But God began to explain to them in chapter 21, I realize that there will be times that you will be beholden to another to tell you what you need to do. But that would be what we would call indentured servants. And most people, because of our terrible history with chattel slavery, of going over and kidnapping, paying for others to kidnap and then buying them and bringing them to America to sell as slaves. But earlier than that, or even ongoing with that, a lot of people from Europe who were in debt would find someone who would cover their debts and pay their way to America if they agreed to be their servant for like 7 years. And then once their debt was paid, they were free to go live their own life. But a number of them didn't have the skills or the ability or certainly any finances to go out on their own. So a number of them just agreed to be like employees of the family that they were indentured servants to, or continue to be an indentured servant of some type. They put a mark up on them if they chose to stay that way. So God is in the process of teaching them that the kind of slavery they experienced in Egypt is not the kind of slavery, servant to others, that I want for you. In fact, in 21 and let me see, what verse is that? I got it written down. 21:16. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. So that kind of slavery is opposed by God and doesn't really want that to be a part of their experience as a nation. And there were times, when they fought other peoples and they would take captives as slaves and things. But the underlying principles of the law and then of the teachings of the New Testament was to undermine the idea of slavery as it has been practiced a lot in history. And indentured servanthood is actually can be a good thing, where someone agrees to pay off your debt by you working for them a certain amount of time and then you're set free. That's actually not a bad deal, kind of a win-win for both parties. So anyway, yeah, these laws are interesting, these next few chapters. Then he goes into they affirm the covenant, and then it starts going into the tabernacle and all of that. And he introduces the 3 annual feasts in chapter 23, verses 14 through 19. So he's laying out their annual year. He's laying out their responsibility, because there'll be separate tribes scattered all over, and he still wants to retain that idea of a unified holy nation. So by having a central tabernacle and then later a temple, and the priesthood mainly residing near that tabernacle and temple, even though they were scattered around to teach the word of God and so forth. But he wanted them to appear 3 times a year in a central place to emphasize that unity of a holy nation, rather than only as separate tribes, separate families. And that's part of the purpose of church today, is that we are to live our Christian life daily as we go about our daily life on our jobs and everything. But then part of the purpose of weekly assembly is to re-emphasize that in our thinking, that we're part of a unified group, a part of a holy nation, an assembly of saints that need to get together on a regular basis. So it's interesting that the ecclesia idea, the being called out from where you are to go to where God wants you to go and assemble with other saints, that underlying principle is very much in these laws that God gave to Israel. So it was, not some brand new idea when we get into the New Testament. It was firmly entrenched within Israel about the ecclesia idea. I don't want to take time to go into all this, but the word ecclesia in the Greek Old Testament, called the Septuagint, is usually from the Hebrew word kahal, Qahal. It's often translated assembly or congregation in our English Old Testaments. But in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, they use the word ecclesia anytime they came across the word kahal. And so the ecclesia idea was very well known. The Jew, especially by the time of the New Testament, they were part of the Greek world, the Greek Empire. And so they would be very familiar with that idea, and it was not anything brand new to them like a lot of people think.
I did probably want to mention, while we're at the point of the tabernacle, the information that was given to Moses in the 24th through the 31st chapter. Wanted to kind of maybe move this into a devotional thought at this point, that first God is teaching the man of God or a spokesman what to say and how to teach his people. We know there's a stumbling between there and in chapter 32 through 34, but chapter 24 through 31, it really is the details of the tabernacle. And we can kind of go in, we could spend some time on this, about how specific those instructions were, and easily turn that into a New Testament understanding of the narrow way and the straight way, that it's not left up to us, that God lays out the plan, he lays out the blueprints, and we cannot deviate from that and be pleasing to him. But that's so Moses first receives the law, receives the information from the man of God, and then the man of God goes and instructs and teaches the people. So he proclaims to the people the details that the Lord taught him. So now we can start connecting the dots of how our New Testament way of service is conducted. God teaches the man of God, his spokesman. His spokesman comes before the people and teaches the people the details of what God taught him. Then as important, or probably, well, as important as the first two, is then we see in chapter 36 through 38, the people gladly received the message of what God told the messenger to say and instruct, and they said yes. They were glad to say yes. And this resulted in action. And I don't know any better church service to where those elements are in place, to where the man of God, being instructed by God, shares that information with the people, and the people say yes, and then we get busy living out our lives based upon what the Lord instructed us through the man of God on a weekly basis. It says that it goes on to say in chapter 39 that Moses inspected out all the work and that it was good. It was right. It was exactly how God wanted it, had instructed him to instruct the people how to do it. And so we could call him an under shepherd or a messenger, as we would put it in New Testament terms even today. And it's by the preaching of the word and the teaching of the word that the people hear. And it's then up to the people to go and do. We would put the term good church all over that. But what kind of stood out to me in a thought was the first time they erected that in the first month of the second year. What did that feel like when they saw it put all back together? Many of them had spent much time on small parts of it, working day and night, or usually daily, and working 6 days a week, because even the law of resting on the seventh applied to when they were making the tabernacle or the components for the tabernacle. But nevertheless, when it was assembled, what did that feel like? And, in my life, when we've been instructed, when there's been a clear vision, when the people say yes, and we get busy and we see the fruits of that labor, what that feels like. So that would be a devotional thought that maybe somebody wants to take off and expand on at that point.
Yeah, there's a lot there, isn't there? It's so let me ask you this, because my wife and I were talking about this morning. They were at Mount Sinai about a year. They set up the tabernacle before they left Sinai, which is kind of interesting in itself. Did they just set it up for a very short time because God had told them, I want you to go? So did they set it up just so they could all see it and experience it for a short time? Then they had to take it right back down for their travel. It's kind of what it seems like. But then also, Moses received the instructions, then he had to pass it on to them, and then they had to start I mean, they had a lot of the materials, but some of the materials they may have had to collect, the area around Mount Sinai. Um, how long? So day after day after day, if you're Bezalel and Aholiab, the two men in charge of the work of the utensils and furnishings and tabernacle, which is interesting in itself also, isn't it? One's Bezalel is from the tribe of Judah, and Holiab is from the tribe of Dan. So neither one is from Levi. You know, you'd think it'd be from the tribe of Levi, that they would be the artisans, as it calls them, of the items of the tabernacle. But God wanted two different tribes, and he included the Judah tribe, which is interesting, the kingly tribe, to be the leader, Bezalel, filled with the Holy Spirit, with wisdom. So God, evidently, he had some skills that were developed in slavery in Egypt. No doubt many of the Jews were taught special trades to do the projects that the Egyptians wanted them to do. So they had developed skills already, but God instilled in them a spiritual quality to it as they made these items. And so I guess my question this morning was, how long were they doing this work day after day after day after day, fashioning all these utensils and furnishings and making the poles and the curtains and everything about the tabernacle? It was somewhat less than a year, but it was probably more than, say, 6 months, maybe 7 or 8 months or something. Do you have a thought on maybe how long they were doing all that work?
Yeah, we read where Moses went up and started getting the instructions at the third month. So, you know, how long that was and how long was it before he came back and shared with the people. So we have the other month pass by or longer. And then by the end of the beginning of the second year, it's going to be assembled. So, you know, 8-9 months at the outside and maybe 8 months. So some information that I looked up, people that have studied this more thorough than I have, pancake between 5 and 6 months to do the construction. So yeah, I wanted to bring up a few points again, because I know we're really getting into a time we just can't cover everything. But for the first time, I considered the acacia wood. You know, we get the whole list of all the things, the gold, the silver, the bronze, the jewels, the oil, some of the other things that they gathered to build the tabernacle. But the acacia wood, I looked up some information on that. It's a common desert tree. So as you mentioned, they would have to go out and gather that. But its density made it suitable for long-term use. It would easily last 400 years, the 400 years that it needed to last, although most of it was covered with gold, but it required a lifespan. But it was also, because it was so dense, it was hard to work with. In fact, kind of modern day furniture makers would say that it dulls their cutting tools very quickly. So the work was hard. It was very hard. But it's what the Ark of the Covenant was made out of before it was covered in gold. It was the altar burnt offering was made out of it. The showbread table, the poles that held up the veils were made of the acacia wood. The boards on all the tabernacles and the sockets that would be made for the bottom before they were covered. And we know by studying in the past, when we consider all the utensils and all the furniture of the tabernacle and then later the temple, definitely were types, we could say, were symbols of Christ or represented Christ. And shittim wood, which Noah built the ark out of, was instructed to build the ark out of, is a specific type of acacia wood. So acacia wood was very common to the area, to the desert regions but was not easy to work with. But something that stood out to me, all of these, we definitely know that the ark was a type of Christ, and the furniture is a type of Christ. But something of note, if you look at some close-ups online of the acacia tree, you'll notice that it has very long, like 3 to 5 inch thorns, very hard thorns, very sharp thorns. It is said by some, because of its availability, that it could have been what the crown that was placed upon our Savior's head was made out of. And so when we consider the acacia tree was used for so much that represented Christ, and then the thorns of that tree are used in the crucifixion event. Is there some symbols there that we want to consider? Or is it Satan, again, using part of what was intended to be for good and a picture of God's Son, and Satan using that same parts of that same acacia tree to commit such a horrible crime against our Lord? So, that kind of stood out to me. You have any thoughts on that?
Oh, that's good stuff. I'm glad you did some research on that. I've probably studied that in the past, but it has slipped my mind, and I'm glad you went into that, because that's really good. And you made a point that I think is really important about working in the Lord's work. It's supposed to be joyful. It's supposed to be pleasant in many ways. It's supposed to cause rejoicing. But sometimes it's just hard work. And, they were doing a great work preparing all these utensils and furnishings in the tabernacle structure itself. But there were many days out in that hot desert sun that they were just sweaty and dirty and filthy and tired, muscles sore from doing all the kind of work that's required to put all these pieces together. And yet it was a spiritual work. So serving the Lord at times does take a lot of effort and energy, and it brings about tiredness and all of that. But underneath it all, it's in obedience to Him, and it's for a good purpose. And I also find it interesting that, we don't, sometimes in the Old Testament especially, we don't put things into context. And this Bezalel, I just really like that guy who was in charge of doing all this work. His actual name means under God's shadow. So God overshadowed him, and he was a special vessel. But his work was work of labor, effort. And he did a great job of it. And he's introduced, especially like in chapter 31, he's introduced as the main artisan to build the temple. He's the general contractor, we might say. Paul called himself the wise master builder in 1 Corinthians 3. So it's not wrong to call a human under God's direction as the steward or the general contractor, the one in charge of all the labor of doing this. And yet in chapter 31, he's described as the one chosen by God for this building with his hands the work of God. And then immediately we go into chapter 32 in the golden calf. And Stephen describes this in Acts 7 as they rejoiced in the work of their own hands. So that's the contrast of these two chapters, is that Bezalel was fashioning physical items under God's direction, and it was good. Aaron and the people in chapter 32 were fashioning a calf, a bull, with some of the same materials used to build the tabernacle, but it was the work of their own hands.
Mhm.
And in our service to God, it's really an important thing to ask God to help us. Lord, let me labor, but let it be you laboring through me,
Mhm.
not the work of my own hands, that I can rejoice in what I have done. And I'd never quite seen that contrast before, chapter 31 and 32, why they're put back to back like this on purpose. Is to show the physical labor with his hands at God's direction was a great thing, and the physical labor at the work of their own hands in the golden calf was an evil thing.
Mhm.
It's just interesting.
For the work of the tabernacle, it does say about um, both of the men that were being led by God, that he gave them the ability to teach. That would be part of what they could do. So they taught people that knew how to make bricks. He taught them a lot of different skills that they may have been exposed to some in Egypt, some of them, but something that stood out to me was I looked up gold, silver, and bronze and their melting point. So they collected all this jewelry, then they needed to melt it down. Gold becomes liquid for pouring into molds at 1,064 Celsius, or 1,947 degrees Fahrenheit, almost
How do you get
2,000
it that
degrees.
hot out in the desert?
Or silver's at 1,700 and bronze is at 1,700. How did they get that? Well, they knew how to build kilns in Egypt to bake bricks in. They understood probably the air needed to be introduced to it, so they probably made baffles. So out there, the work being done in the desert, in the hot desert, also included a kind of a smeltering plant to where they were melting down gold, silver, and bronze. And the workmen then, after it cooled to some point, some of it would be hammered out into sheets of gold and so forth, so it could cover some of the acacia wood furniture. But it was a lot of hard, hot work. I was kind of wondering, as I was thinking about that, only was there a cloud that maybe covered them and protected them from the sun. I think they're on the same time or same similar weather pattern as we are in that area, which would mean they did that hot work in the wintertime. Maybe God was gracious to them and had them do it in the cool months instead of the middle of the summer.
So had you ever thought, this brings up another thought I'd never thought of before. So that they had smelting plants. I mean, it says he threw the gold into the fire and it came out of the calf. It's not quite that simple, is it, based on what you said the temperature needed? So they were actually heating it with extra oxygen and the ways you are able to heat up metal in those days. But you wonder, had Bezalel and his group, in preparation to build the tabernacle items, had already built these smelters for use of the tabernacle, instead of Aaron not taking, it doesn't seem like in chapter 32 they would have taken the time to build up that industry first. Moses was only up on the mountain extra 40 days. Maybe it was already in place to be used for the tabernacle, and that's one reason, not just because they built a calf and said this is the God that's going to take us back to Egypt, and that's, all that idolatry. In fact, I've tried before, and it might be possible that they may have broken all 10 commandments in building that calf. Certainly they broke the first several about idols. They may have done some of the work. The work didn't take place in one 24-hour day. It seemed like it would have taken several days to do all this work to make that golden calf. So they probably broke the Sabbath. They stole what was God intended for the tabernacle, the gold and silver and all that. They stole that and used it for this. And in other ways, the Ten Commandments, they certainly broke the guidance of their fathers and their mothers that had taught them different ways of not committing idolatry. Even in Egypt, they were taught not to commit idolatry. So they may have broken all 10 commandments to some degree, certainly some more than others. But I'm just thinking out loud now that the ability to melt all of this for that golden calf may have been already in place for the purpose of building the items for the tabernacle. And so they misused it. My point is simply that may be why God was so angry, is that they were taking what God had instructed for holy use and had turned it into something unholy. There's something there, I think.
You definitely could consider that when we move forward to New Testament teachings and the way we're supposed to serve the Lord, and that we're supposed to be vessels unto honor for the Lord, but we can easily be used unto dishonor if we allow it.
It is interesting that many years later, when the kingdom split in two and Jeroboam didn't want them going back to Jerusalem or wherever the temple was and so forth, afraid they'd reunite with the king of Judah, that he built two calves of gold in the northern kingdom. So this idea of duplicating what Aaron and those people did in the wilderness, and of course cows or bulls are directly more connected with Egypt and their false gods, whereas Israel, as a mainly shepherd people, didn't build a sheep, didn't build a lamb, they built a bull, connecting their hearts more with Egypt than with being a shepherd people, and the idea of instead of the Lamb of God, it's a cow of Egypt. So there's something there to be explored too.
Another thing that stuck out to me is how many times the women stepped up. Their hearts were stirred also. The making of the bronze laver was made out of the bronze mirrors that they had brought out of Egypt, and we'll even consider, we can also read where they were the weavers of the goat's hair and some of the tapestries. Again, those weren't gathered out in the desert. They were brought with them. We kind of think of the gold and the silver and the earrings and the jewelry being brought out of Egypt, but it seems apparent that there was a whole lot of precious or royal type linens brought out from Egypt too, that they could easily convert and make into the curtains and so forth that God had instructed them to do. But they were the willing vessels very often being used. And again, it's kind of the ownership point. Again, that first time that was set up, and the amazement, not only from the men, but the women and the children, because they saw their parents doing the work day by day by day, and it was hard work. And how much were the children even involved in it? We don't know. But that whole ownership piece is a piece that was taught to many of us from a very young age, even when it comes to the whether it's the property or whether it's the taking care of the business of the Lord's churches. That ownership piece is vital when we understand and try to fully understand the preciousness of the Lord's kingdom work. Sometimes we can be very light on the next generation, thinking we're doing them a favor, and then the ownership, we start questioning as they mature or should be maturing and get older. We start questioning whether they have ownership in this work or not. Maybe maybe we just let them set aside and not do any of the work. So that's just kind of a side thought.
Oh, good thoughts. I do like how, as a pastor, I had to kind of smile when we were reading chapter 36 this morning, how that God told. So, as you said, they all pitched in to do the work, but they all pitched in to give the materials as well. So they gave the materials and then they worked the materials. They gave to the Lord of their own, and then they worked on what they had given to the Lord. So that there's a lot there about what we are to do today. But I really like in chapter 36 where they gave so much, they gave more than enough. And they were told to stop. You've already given too much. Boy, that's not a problem today. We'd like to have that problem, telling the people, stop giving, you're giving too much. And another thing when we were reading this morning that kind of jumped out at us is, I think people face this when we read through Exodus. So we read through all the chapters about God giving Moses the details of how many cubits this cubits high, this wide, and this long, and this many, and so you eyes almost get kind of cross reading through those chapters of God giving those detailed instructions to Moses, and then you got to go through it all again when Moses is instructing the artisans, and it says that they were doing it, and it goes through the same things again. You think, didn't I just read this a few days ago? The same thing. Why does God repeat all of this? Why can't he just say, okay, Moses told him and they did it how he told them? But by going into great detail twice in repetition, it's God's making a statement. I told them this is how to do it, and then this is proof that they did it exactly how I told them. So it's just a way to make the point that it was done, as it says several times, according to what I told you or commanded you in the mount. Do it exactly as I told you. So they really didn't have to make any decisions, or not the kind of decisions we would think of. God gave them enough detail that their job was just to follow the blueprint that God gave them. And so he kind of took it out of their hands, letting them know, this is my house, this is my project. You're just fellow laborers, but I'm the one that's drawing the blueprint, and it's your job to follow it. And then it closes, chapter 40, verses 34 through 38, the cloud and the glory. Then the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Can you imagine what that was like? So I don't know what would be more dramatic. Would it have been back in chapter 19 of the lightning and thunder and cloud on top of the mountain, and they got afraid, and there were trumpets and there were voices, and it was just like overwhelming in chapter 19? Or this, when the tabernacle was finally set up, and that what they had seen on top of Mount Sinai was now settling over the tabernacle. It's so easy to pick on these people for their lack of faith and lack of obedience, and why that generation was not able to go into the promised land, because you would just think this would make such a deep impression. If you saw these kind of things with your own eyes and heard them with your own ears, that you'd never go astray. It just tells us a lot about human nature and how quickly, what's that song we love to sing? Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. And that's just a part of all of us. And we're not a lot different than they were. Just easy to pick on them, but God can point his finger right at us and say, well, how about you?
So God coming down on the tabernacle, and from their view, it's his presence and it's his approval of all the things that we've been able to accomplish with his help. I imagine it was just, again, we would call that good church today, when we see God's blessing it. His presence is there and it's very clear, and he's blessing the fruit of our labors, but the fruit of our labors are just an extension of what he told us to do and what he how he provided a way for it to get done.
And it says a lot about God's mercy and grace, that in spite of all their complaints, in spite of their sins, in spite of their rebellious spirit, when that tabernacle was set up, he came down and blessed it.
Mm-hmm.
And God is, as it says a few times in those chapters, that he's gracious and full of mercy. His loving kindness is there. It overrules our weakness and our sins. And God often chooses to bless us even though we don't deserve it pretty much all the time. He still overrules that and blesses us. And that's what happened at the end of Exodus should have really been humbling to them as they realized, boy, we just really blew it a few times, complaining and golden calf and the whole thing. But it's humbling to see that God still is able to show his goodness to us in spite of our failures.
Mm-hmm. Well, I enjoyed the conversation today and the information that was shared, and we hope you are excited about joining us for the next few sessions as we deal with Leviticus.
That'll be interesting how we deal with Leviticus. Genesis and Exodus has a lot of stories that you can kind of flesh out. Leviticus is a lot about sacrifices and the priesthood and so forth. But there's a lot of important stuff in Leviticus that we don't want to overlook. So thank you all, and appreciate some of the feedback we've been getting, and hope it's a blessing to you as we work our way through the Bible in fifth gear, just trying to hit the highlights, and maybe things that are said that will challenge your thinking and stir you to further study. So God bless all of you.